Imagine the greatest city in the world, a city at the heart of a vast global empire, a marvel of engineering, of commerce, and of power. A city of iron bridges, of grand museums, of bustling stock exchanges, and of a queen who ruled over a quarter of the world's population. This was London, in the middle of the 19th century. But this glorious modern metropolis harbored a dark, foul and deadly secret, a secret that flowed thick and black through its very heart. For the River Thames, the ancient artery of the city, was no longer a river. It was an open sewer. Tonight, we will not tell a story of queens and prime ministers in their grand halls. We will tell the story of the summer when the city's great hidden sin rose from the depths and held the most powerful men in the world hostage. This is the story of the Great Stink of 1858, a tale of a city suffocating on its own success, and of the terrifying invisible enemy that lurked in its foul air. Now, before we take our first cautious breath of Victorian London's air, and you get comfortable for the night, if you enjoy this kind of immersive journey into the past, please take a moment to leave a like and to subscribe, but only if you genuinely find value in what we do here. And as always, I would love to know from what part of the world you are listening tonight, and what time it is where you are. Feel free to leave it in the comments. It is a quiet fascination to see our community of night owls and history lovers spread across the globe. All right, the time has come. Find your most comfortable position, dim the lights, let the anxieties of the modern world fade away, and let us step into the heart of the British Empire, a place of immense pride and of an even greater stench. To be alive in London in the year 1858 was to believe you were at the center of the universe. The city was a roaring, magnificent engine of progress. Its factories produced goods that were shipped to every corner of the globe. Its banks controlled the world's finances. Its newspapers reported on an empire so vast that the sun, it was famously said, never set upon it. The streets were a chaotic, vibrant testament to this new age of industry. They were crowded with horse-drawn omnibuses, with elegant carriages, with the hurried and purposeful footsteps of a population that was swelling at an unprecedented rate. Great new monuments to Victorian ingenuity were rising everywhere. The Crystal Palace, a cathedral of iron and glass, had recently stunned the world. The great iron bridges that spanned the Thames were marvels of modern engineering. London was the future. But to understand the great crisis of that year, one must first understand the scientific and medical worldview of the time. The doctors and scientists of the Victorian era were men of great learning, but they were operating in a world that was still largely invisible to them. The true nature of disease was a profound and terrifying mystery. They did not know about bacteria. They did not know about viruses. They only knew what their senses told them. And their senses told them one thing with an unshakable certainty. Disease was carried on the air. This was the miasma theory. It was the belief that diseases like cholera, typhoid, and the plague were caused by miasma or bad air, a foul, invisible, and poisonous vapor that rose from rotting organic matter. It was a theory that seemed on the surface to make perfect sense. The poorest, most crowded parts of the city, the places where the filth and the stench were the worst, were also the places where disease was most rampant. The conclusion seemed obvious. The smell itself was the killer. A foul odor was not just a symptom of sickness, it was the sickness itself, a physical, airborne poison that could infect a healthy person with a single unlucky breath. This belief governed every aspect of public health. A respectable person would carry a handkerchief scented with perfume or vinegar to hold to their nose when passing through a particularly foul-smelling slum. The windows of homes were kept tightly shut, not to keep out the cold, but to keep out the dangerous night air, which was believed to be thick with miasma. The fight against disease was a fight against smell. And in the city of London, in 1858, there was no greater source of smell, no greater source of miasma than the River Thames. The great river, which had for centuries been the city's main artery of commerce and its primary source of drinking water, had become a monstrous open sewer. The problem was one of success. The city's population had exploded, growing from less than 1 million people at the beginning of the century to almost 3 million, and all of the waste produced by these millions of people, the human waste from their homes, the industrial waste from the tanneries, the slaughterhouses, the chemical factories, all of it, by law, was funneled into a series of ancient and crumbling sewers that emptied directly and without treatment into the heart of the river. The great modern innovation of the flush toilet, a symbol of Victorian progress and cleanliness, had only made the problem worse. In the older London, waste was collected in cesspools, brick-lined pits in the basements or gardens of the houses. These were smelly and inefficient, but they contained the waste. But as the city grew, the cesspools began to overflow, seeping into the soil and contaminating the wells from which many people still drew their drinking water. The solution, in the eyes of the city's early sanitarians, was simple: connect the new flush toilets directly to the old sewer system. It was an act of profound and ultimately catastrophic short-sightedness. They had solved the problem of the overflowing cesspools by turning the entire River Thames into one. The river was dying. It was no longer a living body of water. It was a thick, black, and almost stagnant soup of raw, untreated sewage. The fish had long since disappeared. The birds had fled its banks. The very water itself was a toxic brew, a time bomb of disease and decay, flowing slowly through the center of the world's greatest city. And in the summer of 1858, that time bomb was about to explode. The great river, the Thames, had for centuries been the city's lifeblood. It was its main highway, its source of fish, its playground, and, for many, its primary source of drinking water. But the London of 1858 was a city engaged in the slow, unwitting act of mass suicide, and the river was its chosen weapon. The source of this slow poisoning was a paradox. London was a victim of its own unprecedented success. The Industrial Revolution had turned the city into a global behemoth, a roaring engine of commerce and empire. People flocked to it from all over the country and the world, desperate for work. The population had exploded, growing from less than 1 million people at the beginning of the century to nearly 3 million souls crammed into its sprawling, chaotic districts. And all of the waste produced by these millions of people, the human waste from their homes, the industrial waste from the tanneries, the slaughterhouses, the chemical factories, the breweries, all of it, by law, was funneled into a series of ancient, crumbling sewers that had been built for a much smaller, pre-industrial city. These sewers were never designed to handle such a volume. They were simply channels designed to carry rainwater away, and they emptied directly and without any form of treatment into the heart of the river. Even the great modern innovation of the flush toilet, a symbol of Victorian progress in cleanliness that was being installed with pride in the homes of the wealthy, had only made the problem catastrophically worse. In the older London of just a few decades prior, human waste was collected in cesspools, brick-lined pits in the basements or gardens of the houses. These were smelly, inefficient, and often overflowed, but they contained the waste on site, a localized problem. As the city grew, the cesspools began to overflow at an alarming rate, their foul contents seeping into the soil and contaminating the shallow wells from which many Londoners still drew their drinking water. This contamination was the direct cause of the terrifying and deadly cholera epidemics that had swept through the city in 1831 and again in 1848, killing tens of thousands. The physicians of the day, with their belief in the miasma theory, did not understand the link between the contaminated water and the disease, but they knew the cesspools were a source of foul and therefore dangerous air. The solution, in the eyes of the city's early sanitarians, was simple and seemingly logical. Get the waste away from the houses. They mandated that the overflowing cesspools be closed and that all homes be connected directly to the old sewer system. It was an act of profound and ultimately catastrophic short-sightedness. They had solved the problem of the localized cesspools by turning the entire River Thames into one vast, city-sized cesspool. Every flush of every new toilet in London was another nail in the river's coffin,
sending its contents on a short, direct journey into the city's main artery. The river was dying. It was no longer a living body of water, a natural ecosystem. It had become a thick, black, and almost stagnant soup of raw, untreated sewage. The once abundant salmon, a fish so common in Tudor times that apprentices had clauses in their contracts stipulating they would not be forced to eat it more than 3 times a week, had long since disappeared. The birds had fled its banks. The very water itself was a toxic, anaerobic brew, a chemical and biological horror story. The newspapers of the day were filled with grim and often darkly humorous accounts of the river's state. The Times described it as a Stygian pool, reeking with ineffable and unbearable horror. Scientists who lowered test papers into the water found that they were blackened and corroded in a matter of minutes. It was said that the water was so thick with filth that it could no longer be properly described as a liquid. A visiting scientist, Michael Faraday, famously dropped his white calling cards into the river from a bridge, only to see them disappear from sight in less than an inch of the opaque brown water. The river did not flow in the way a normal river does. London is a tidal city, and the flow of the Thames is dictated by the twice-daily rise and fall of the sea. This meant that the millions of gallons of sewage pouring into the river did not simply flow out to the estuary. They were carried downstream on the ebb tide, a great foul slick of human and industrial waste. And then, a few hours later, the flood tide would come in from the sea and push the entire mass of filth back upstream through the very heart of the city. This great oscillating river of sewage would slosh back and forth day after day, a horrifying, predictable, and seemingly permanent feature of London life. With each cycle of the tide, it would deposit thick, black, and incredibly foul-smelling banks of mud on the shores. At low tide, these banks, 6 feet deep in places, would be exposed to the sun, their surfaces bubbling with methane gas from the decomposition below. This was the great, stinking, and deadly secret of the world's most modern city. The river that had once been its pride was now its shame, a time bomb of disease and decay flowing slowly and menacingly through the center of the world's greatest empire. And in the long, hot, and unusually rainless summer of 1858, that time bomb was about to explode.
The city of London, in the years leading up to 1858, was not living in a state of blissful ignorance. It was living in a state of profound and deeply flawed understanding. The connection between the filth of the city and the diseases that ravaged its population was obvious to everyone. The great cholera epidemics of 1831 and 1848 had torn through the poorest, most crowded districts, leaving tens of thousands dead in their wake. And in every case, the outbreaks were worst in the areas where the stench was the most powerful, where the filth was the most concentrated. This, to the medical and scientific establishment of the time, was proof positive of the miasma theory. They believed that cholera was an airborne disease, a poisonous vapor that rose from the decomposing matter in the cesspools and the river. Their response, while logical from their point of view, was tragically misguided. They advocated for the systematic flushing of all sources of filth into the River Thames, believing that this would disperse the dangerous miasma into the air and carry it away from the population. They did not understand that the true enemy was not in the air they breathed, but in the water they drank. There were a few lone voices crying out in the wilderness. A physician named John Snow had, through a brilliant and painstaking investigation during the 1854 cholera outbreak in Soho, proven that the disease was spread not by air, but by a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street. He had removed the handle from the pump, and the local outbreak had ceased. It was a revolutionary and entirely correct discovery. But his germ theory, the idea that diseases were caused by invisible living organisms in the water, was seen as a strange and eccentric fantasy
by the medical establishment. They clung to the visible, tangible, and terrifying reality of the stench. John Snow's work was largely ignored. And so the city continued its fatal policy. More and more cesspools were closed. More and more homes were connected to the sewers. And the river, the city's main source of drinking water for many, became ever more concentrated with the very poison that was killing them. The water companies, who were responsible for supplying London with its drinking water, would simply pump the water from the Thames, allow the solid matter to settle for a few hours in a reservoir, and then send it directly into the homes of their customers. They were, in effect, serving a diluted solution of their own city's waste back to the population. The problem was not a secret. It was a subject of endless and ultimately fruitless debate in the halls of Parliament and in the pages of the newspapers. Everyone agreed that something had to be done. The city was suffocating. But the sheer scale of the problem and the immense cost of any potential solution led to a state of political paralysis. Commission after commission was formed. They produced vast, detailed reports filled with horrifying statistics and grim descriptions of the state of the river. They drew up dozens of different competing plans for a new, comprehensive sewer system. Some proposed a single, massive central tunnel. Others advocated for a series of smaller, interconnected sewers. They argued about where the final outfall should be. Should the sewage be dumped into the river further downstream, simply making it someone else's problem? Or should it be used as fertilizer on the fields of Kent and Essex? The debates raged for years. The cost was the greatest obstacle. A proper sewer system would be the largest and most expensive public works project in the history of the world, and no one wanted to pay for it. The different competing administrative bodies of London, the City of London Corporation, the various parish councils, all argued that it was someone else's responsibility. And so, nothing was done. The city continued to grow, the river continued to die, and the great, stinking, ticking time bomb at the heart of the British Empire continued to wait. It was a problem so vast, so overwhelming, that it seemed easier to simply ignore it, to hold a scented handkerchief to one's nose and hope that the wind would change. But in the summer of 1858, the wind would not change. The time for debate was over. The consequences of decades of neglect were about to rise from the river and hold the entire city hostage. The summer of 1858 began with a deceptive beauty. June was a month of brilliant, uninterrupted sunshine. The sky over London was a rare, clear, and vibrant blue. But this beautiful weather was not a blessing. It was the fuse being lit on the city's great, stinking time bomb. For weeks there was no rain. The flow of the River Thames, which was already sluggish, slowed to a crawl. The water level dropped, exposing vast, dark banks of mud on either side of the river. Mud that was not natural silt, but a thick, black, and gelatinous accumulation of centuries of human and industrial waste. And then came the heat. It was a relentless, oppressive hate wave, the kind that Londoners, accustomed to their mild, damp climate, were not prepared for. The city became a great stone oven. The air was still, heavy, and hot to the touch, and the sun, beating down day after day on the exposed banks of the river, began to cook the raw sewage. The process of putrefaction, of decomposition, accelerated at an alarming rate. The thick, black mud of the riverbanks began to bubble, releasing great, slow bursts of methane and hydrogen sulfide gas into the hot, still air. The river itself, which had been a relatively passive repository of filth, was now actively spewing a foul, invisible poison into the atmosphere. The stench began subtly. It was at first just the familiar, unpleasant odor of the river, slightly stronger than usual. But day by day, as the heat wave continued, the smell grew in intensity, in complexity, in its sheer, inescapable presence. It was no longer just a smell. It was a physical entity, a thick, greasy, and suffocating fog that seeped into every corner of the city. The newspapers of the day struggled to find the words to describe it. They called it a pestilential stench, a veritable plague of evil odors, an abomination. It was described as a mixture of the city's worst smells, the tanneries, the slaughterhouses, the graveyards. It was a smell that seemed to have a texture, a weight. It coated your tongue. It made your eyes water. It clung to the back of your throat. The great stink had begun, and it would not be a brief, passing inconvenience. It was a siege. The city of London, the greatest and most powerful city in the world, was under attack from its own river.
The Great Stink did not just affect the poor who lived by the riverbanks. It was a democratic plague of the senses. It respected no social barriers. The foul air, the great miasma, seeped into every corner of the city, from the most wretched slum to the most opulent Mayfair mansion. The entire city, the richest and most powerful metropolis on earth, was under siege from its own filth. Life for the ordinary Londoner became a daily battle against an invisible, inescapable enemy. The simple act of breathing became a conscious and often disgusting effort. People began to walk the streets with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, often soaked in perfume, vinegar, or lavender water, in a desperate and largely futile attempt to filter out the stench. The sales of perfume and smelling salts skyrocketed. The well-to-do would carry pomanders, small ornate metal balls filled with fragrant herbs and spices, which they would hold to their noses as a personal, portable defense against the foul air. The windows of houses, which would normally be thrown open to catch any hint of a breeze during the hot summer months, were now kept tightly shut, sealed with rags and strips of paper. Heavy curtains were doused in chloride of lime, a powerful disinfectant, their chemical smell mingling with the stench from outside to create a strange, new, and equally unpleasant domestic aroma. Business in the city began to grind to a halt. The shops that lined the Thames, the ones with the most desirable riverfront views, were the first to suffer. Their wealthy customers simply stopped coming. People who had the means to do so began to flee the city, their carriages piled high with luggage, heading for the clean, fresh air of the countryside. London, for the first time in its modern history, began to empty. For those who could not afford to leave, which was the vast majority of the population, there was no escape. They were trapped. They tried to combat the stench with their own, often bizarre remedies. It was common to see small bonfires burning in the streets, fueled not with wood, but with fragrant materials like juniper wood, or even old, tarred rope, the belief being that a strong, clean smoke could drive away the foul miasma. The air, already thick with the smoke of 1,000,000 coal fires, became even thicker, a strange, fragrant, and deeply unhealthy haze. The river itself, the source of the problem, became a scene of morbid fascination. People would gather on the city's bridges, their faces wrapped in cloth, to stare down at the thick, black, and almost stagnant water. They would watch as great bubbles of methane gas would rise from the depths and burst on the surface, releasing a fresh,
concentrated wave of the stench. They would watch the strange, greasy film that coated the water, a rainbow slick of industrial and human waste. The newspapers sent reporters to the riverbanks, who wrote vivid and often horrifying accounts of what they saw and smelled. One of the most popular and most desperate theories was that the stench was a sign of an impending plague, a new cholera epidemic like the ones that had ravaged the city in the past. And this fear was not unfounded. The death rate in the city began to rise. People were not dying from a new plague, but from the simple, age-old diseases of filth: typhoid, dysentery, cholera. In a city where many still drew their drinking water directly from the stinking river, the hot, dry summer was creating the perfect conditions for a public health catastrophe. The city was in a state of crisis. It was a slow, stinking, and deeply unnerving apocalypse. The greatest city in the world was being brought to its knees, not by an invading army, but by the simple and entirely predictable consequences of its own accumulated filth. And the men in power, the men in Parliament, were about to discover that even their high stone walls and their ancient traditions offered no protection from the all-pervading, democratic, and deeply angry stench of the River Thames. The Great Stink was not a constant, uniform thing. It was a dynamic, shifting entity, its character changing with the time of day and the turn of the tide. The mornings were often the most bearable. A slight, cool breeze might offer a brief respite, a momentary illusion that the worst was over. But as the sun climbed into the sky and the heat began to beat down on the city, the stench would awaken from its slumber. The worst time of day was the low tide. As the water level in the Thames dropped, it would expose the vast, black, glistening banks of filth that lined the river. This was not mud. It was a thick, gelatinous sludge, 6 feet deep in places, a physical accumulation of the city's history, a putrid archive of everything London had consumed and discarded for centuries. As the hot sun baked this exposed sewage, it would release its gases, and a new, more powerful and more complex wave of the stench would roll through the city. It was a smell that was not just unpleasant, it was a physical assault. It was a smell that people claimed could be felt, a thick, greasy presence in the air that seemed to coat the skin and the back of the throat. The newspapers of the day were filled with vivid and often darkly humorous accounts of the sensory apocalypse. Reporters would write of the strange, shifting colors of the river, of the bubbles of methane that would burst on its surface, of the almost complete absence of any living thing, save for the eels that seemed to thrive in the toxic brew. They told stories of men fainting on the bridges, of women falling ill simply from the power of the smell. But the most famous and most consequential victims of the Great Stink were the men who governed the British Empire, the members of Parliament. The newly rebuilt Palace of Westminster, a grand Gothic cathedral of democracy, had been designed with a fatal flaw. Its magnificent riverfront terraces and its great arched windows were designed to let in the fresh, cooling breezes from the Thames. But in the summer of 1858, these windows were not a source of comfort. They were a direct conduit for the foulest air in the city. The politicians, the most powerful men in the world, were under direct attack from the river. They tried to hide back. They ordered that the heavy velvet curtains of the Parliament be soaked in a solution of chloride of lime, a powerful disinfectant. The idea was that the chemical-soaked cloth would supposedly purify any air that entered the rooms. The only result was that the already unbearable stench of the river was now mixed with the sharp, acrid chemical smell of the chloride of lime, creating a new and even more nauseating perfume. The situation became intolerable. Debates in the House of Commons were cut short as members, their faces green, were forced to flee the chamber
their handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. The business of the greatest empire on earth was being brought to a halt by a bad smell. It was in this moment of crisis, of a profound and deeply personal discomfort, that the years of political paralysis and debate finally came to an end. The problem of the Thames was no longer an abstract, theoretical issue to be discussed in committees. It was a direct, physical, and deeply humiliating assault on the very heart of the British government. The time for talking was over. The time for action had arrived.
The newly rebuilt Palace of Westminster, the grand and glorious home of the British Parliament, was a monument to Victorian pride and power. A magnificent Gothic Revival masterpiece, it had been designed to be a symbol of the nation's enduring strength and its connection to its own ancient history. And it had been built with its face to the river. The architect, Charles Barry, had designed a great 800-foot-long riverfront terrace, a beautiful promenade of pale stone where members of Parliament could walk, take the air, and contemplate the majestic flow of the Thames, the great artery of their empire. The committee rooms, the libraries, the very chambers of the House of Commons and the House of Lords themselves were designed with great tall windows facing the water, designed to let in the natural light and the cooling breezes of the river. In the summer of 1858, this architectural decision, once a symbol of prestige, became a catastrophic and deeply ironic design flaw. The Palace of Westminster was not just near the source of the Great Stink, it was built directly upon it. The river, which was supposed to be its beautiful natural companion, had become a besieging army, and the grand windows were the breach in the walls through which the enemy was pouring in. The assault began in earnest in June. The first line of defense was to simply close the windows, but the heat wave that was baking the sewage on the riverbanks was also turning the city into an oven. The great, high-ceilinged rooms of Parliament, designed for a cooler climate, became stifling, airless chambers. The members of Parliament, dressed in their heavy, formal wool coats, were forced to choose between suffocation in the heat and asphyxiation from the stench. They chose to fight back. In a move that speaks to the profound scientific ignorance of the age, the authorities ordered that the great, heavy velvet curtains of the Parliament be soaked in a solution of chloride of lime, a powerful disinfectant. The idea, born of the miasma theory, was that the chemical-soaked cloth would act as a great filter, a screen that would purify any air that entered the rooms, neutralizing the poisonous vapors. The only result was that the already unbearable stench of the river was now mixed with the sharp, acrid chemical smell of the chloride of lime, creating a new and even more nauseating perfume. The smell of decay was now accompanied by the smell of a chemical factory. It was a smell that made the eyes water, that irritated the throat, and that did absolutely nothing to mask the underlying horror of the river's breath. The situation became a national embarrassment. The most powerful men in the world, the men who governed a global empire, were being held hostage by a bad smell. The newspapers of the day had a field day. They published satirical cartoons depicting a skeletal Father Thames rising from the river to haunt the halls of Parliament. They wrote editorials that dripped with sarcasm, noting the irony that a government which could project its power to the farthest corners of the earth was unable to clean its own doorstep. The members of Parliament themselves became desperate. They would arrive at Westminster clutching scented handkerchiefs to their faces, a fragrant but ultimately useless defense. They tried to mask the smell by burning fragrant herbs and spices in the committee rooms. They complained, they made speeches, they wrote angry letters to the Times. But the stench was relentless. It seeped in through the floorboards, through the cracks in the window frames, through the very stones of the building itself. It was an all-pervading, democratic, and deeply angry presence, and it was about to bring the business of the British Empire to a complete and total halt. The situation inside the Palace of Westminster had moved beyond a simple inconvenience. It had become a full-blown crisis, an assault that was both physiological and psychological. The great Gothic halls, designed to be the very symbol of British power and endurance, were rendered almost uninhabitable. The members of Parliament, men accustomed to the comforts of their London clubs and their country estates, found themselves trapped in a miasma of their own making. Imagine the scene in the House of Commons. The chamber is a masterpiece of woodwork and leather, but the air is thick and greasy, a tangible presence that coats the back of the throat. The great arched windows that overlook the river are sealed shut, the heavy crimson velvet curtains drawn tight, their fabric soaked in chloride of lime. The room is stiflingly hot, the air unmoving, and yet the stench of the river still finds its way in, a low, constant, and deeply foul note that underlies every debate, every speech. The politicians tried to continue the business of the empire, but it was a losing battle. A member would rise to speak about a bill concerning the governance of India, his voice strong and authoritative, only to falter, his face turning a pale shade of green as a particularly pungent wave of the stench drifted in from the river. Men would be seen dabbing at their faces with scented handkerchiefs, not out of a sense of foppishness, but out of a desperate, primal need to block out the smell. The library, a place of quiet contemplation, became a place of quiet suffering. The law books themselves, it was claimed, had begun to absorb the smell, their leather bindings exuding a faint but unmistakable odor of sewage. The crisis reached its peak in late June and early July. The debates in Parliament were no longer about distant colonies or economic policy. They were about a single, overwhelming issue: the river. The transcripts from these debates paint a vivid picture of a government in a state of near panic. One member rose to his feet, his face a mask of fury and disgust. He declared, "We can no longer, sir, ignore the monstrous evil that is festering at our merry doors. While we sit here debating the affairs of nations, a pestilence of our own creation is threatening to poison every man, woman, and child in this great city. The River Thames, once the source of our pride, is now a national disgrace, a river of shame." Another member, more pragmatic, pointed to the immediate practical problem. "It is not a matter of shame, sir. It is a matter of government. How can we be expected to conduct the business of Her Majesty's government when the very air we breathe is an offence to God and man? The committee rooms are unbearable. The libraries are a torment. We are prisoners in our own Parliament." There were, of course, those who argued for caution, for delay. They spoke of the immense cost of any proposed solution. To build a new sewer system would be to embark on the most expensive public works project in the history of the world. Where is the money to come from? Are we to raise taxes on our already burdened citizens to pay for what is, after all, a temporary, if unpleasant, inconvenience of the summer weather? But their arguments were drowned out by the sheer, overwhelming reality of the stench. The press, particularly the new satirical magazines like Punch, were merciless in their criticism. They published powerful cartoons depicting a skeletal Father Thames rising from the filthy water to haunt the halls of Parliament. They portrayed the city of London as a magnificent, bejeweled queen holding a perfumed handkerchief to her nose while sitting on top of a mountain of filth. The Great Stink was not just a crisis, it was a national humiliation, a story that was being read with a mixture of horror and amusement in every capital city in Europe. The situation inside the Palace of Westminster had moved beyond a simple inconvenience. It had become a full-blown crisis, an assault that was both physiological and psychological. The great Gothic halls, designed to be the very symbol of British power and endurance, were rendered almost uninhabitable. The members of Parliament, men accustomed to the comforts of their London clubs and their country estates, found themselves trapped in a miasma of their own making. Imagine the scene in the House of Commons. The chamber is a masterpiece of woodwork and leather, but the air is thick and greasy, a tangible presence that coats the back of the throat. The great arched windows that overlook the river are sealed shut, the heavy crimson velvet curtains drawn tight, their fabric soaked in chloride of lime. The room is stiflingly hot, the air unmoving, and yet the stench of the river still finds its way in, a low, constant, and deeply foul note that underlies every debate, every speech. The politicians tried to continue the business of the empire, but it was a losing battle. A member would rise to speak about a bill concerning the governance of India, his voice strong and authoritative, only to falter, his face turning a pale shade of green as a particularly pungent wave of the stench drifted in from the river. Men would be seen dabbing at their faces with scented handkerchiefs, not out of a sense of foppishness, but out of a desperate, primal need to block out the smell. The library, a place of quiet contemplation, became a place of quiet suffering. The law books themselves, it was claimed, had begun to absorb the smell, their leather bindings exuding a faint but unmistakable odor of sewage. The crisis reached its peak in late June and early July. The debates in Parliament were no longer about distant colonies or economic policy. They were about a single, overwhelming issue: the river. The transcripts from these debates paint a vivid picture of a government in a state of near panic. One member rose to his feet, his face a mask of fury and disgust. He declared, "We can no longer, sir, ignore the monstrous evil that is festering at our merry doors. While we sit here debating the affairs of nations, a pestilence of our own creation is threatening to poison every man, woman, and child in this great city. The River Thames, once the source of our pride, is now a national disgrace, a river of shame." Another member, more pragmatic, pointed to the immediate practical problem. "It is not a matter of shame, sir. It is a matter of government. How can we be expected to conduct the business of Her Majesty's government when the very air we breathe is an offence to God and man? The committee rooms are unbearable. The libraries are a torment. We are prisoners in our own Parliament." There were, of course, those who argued for caution, for delay. They spoke of the immense cost of any proposed solution. To build a new sewer system would be to embark on the most expensive public works project in the history of the world. Where is the money to come from? Are we to raise taxes on our already burdened citizens to pay for what is, after all, a temporary, if unpleasant, inconvenience of the summer weather? But their arguments were drowned out by the sheer overwhelming reality of the stench. The press, particularly the new satirical magazines like Punch, were merciless in their criticism. They published powerful cartoons depicting a skeletal Father Thames rising from the filthy water to haunt the halls of Parliament. They portrayed the city of London as a magnificent, bejeweled queen holding a perfumed handkerchief to her nose while sitting on top of a mountain of filth. The Great Stink was not just a crisis, it was a national humiliation, a story that was being read with a mixture of horror and amusement in every capital city in Europe.
The final straw came during a particularly hot week in July. A plan was hatched to flee. There was a serious proposal to move the entire Parliament, the very heart of the British government, out of London, perhaps to Oxford or to St. Albans, anywhere to escape the unbearable smell. This, more than anything else, was a sign of their utter desperation. The idea that the rulers of the greatest empire on earth would be forced to abandon their own capital city was a humiliation too great to bear. It was at this moment that one man, a politician who would later become Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, rose to speak. He was a master of political theatre. and he understood that this was a moment of profound crisis, but also of profound opportunity. He declared that the issue of the river was not a simple matter of public works, but a matter of national survival. He introduced a bill, the Metropolis Local Management Amendment Bill, a dry, bureaucratic title for what was, in effect, an act of emergency legislation. His speech was a masterpiece of political rhetoric. He did not speak of cost. He spoke of duty. He did not speak of engineering. He spoke of national pride. And as he spoke, the members of the House, their faces grim, their handkerchiefs pressed to their noses, listened. The years of debate, of delay, of political paralysis were finally over, burned away by the simple, undeniable, and utterly foul reality of the great stink. The time for talking was over. The time for action had, at long last, arrived.
The decision to act, forced upon Parliament by the sheer, unbearable stench of their own river, was a moment of profound crisis. But it was also a moment of immense opportunity, and there was one man in London who had been waiting for this moment for nearly a decade. His name was Joseph Bazalgette, the chief engineer of the newly formed Metropolitan Board of Works. Bazalgette was not a politician. He did not deal in speeches, in compromises, or in the delicate art of persuasion. He was a man of science, of iron, of brick and mortar. He was a brilliant and deeply stubborn engineer, a man who thought not in terms of votes and alliances, but in terms of gradients and flow rates and the immense, beautiful, and unstoppable power of gravity. He was, in many ways, the perfect embodiment of the Victorian age, a man of immense vision, of tireless work ethic, and of an unshakable faith in the power of engineering to solve the great problems of the modern world. For years, Bazalgette had been a voice crying out in the wilderness. He had watched the endless, fruitless debates of the various commissions and committees with a growing, simmering sense of frustration. He had submitted plan after plan for a comprehensive new sewer system, each one more detailed, more meticulously calculated than the last, only to see them bogged down in a swamp of political infighting and endless arguments over cost. He knew, with the cold, hard certainty of a man who understands the fundamental laws of physics, that the city's approach to its own waste was not just a nuisance, it was a slow-motion catastrophe, a public health disaster waiting to happen. While the politicians debated, the people of London were dying. His plan, which he had been refining for years in his dusty office, was audacious in its scale and breathtaking in its elegant simplicity. He did not propose to simply build a bigger sewer to dump the waste further down the river, a solution that many of his contemporaries favored. He saw that as a short-sighted and ultimately futile gesture. He proposed to fundamentally re-engineer the city's relationship with its own river, to create a new, hidden world beneath the streets of London, a world that would save the city from itself. His vision was for a great new subterranean river of brick. He planned to build a series of massive, gently sloping interceptor sewers running from west to east along both the north and south banks of the Thames. These great tunnels, some of them large enough to drive a horse and carriage through, would be the new arteries of the city. They would be positioned to intercept the waste from the hundreds of smaller, older sewers before it could reach the river, catching the filth in its tracks, and then, using the simple, reliable, and eternal power of gravity, they would carry this vast, foul river of sewage far to the east, miles downstream of the city, to be released into the estuary on the outgoing tide, where it could be washed harmlessly out to sea. It was a plan of immense elegance and brutal practical logic. It was also a plan of almost unimaginable ambition. It would require the excavation of millions upon millions of tons of earth, a great surgical incision through the very heart of the world's largest city. It would require the firing of hundreds of millions of bricks, enough to build a small city in themselves. It would require the invention of a new kind of cement, Portland cement, that could withstand the constant damp and the corrosive power of the sewage. It would be the largest and most expensive civil engineering project the world had ever seen, and it was the only thing that could save London from drowning in its own filth. Bazalgette was a man of meticulous, almost obsessive detail. He had surveyed every street, every sewer, every subtle gradient in the sprawling, chaotic map of London. He understood the city not as a collection of neighborhoods, but as a complex hydrological system, a great living organism with its own circulatory system. He had planned for everything. He knew that the population of London would continue to grow, that the city would continue to expand. So, in a stroke of pure, unadulterated genius, he, famously and brilliantly, doubled the diameter of the pipes in his plans. "We're only going down once, and we may as well do it properly," he was said to have remarked. This single decision, this act of incredible foresight, would ensure that his system would continue to function effectively for over a century, long after he was gone. For years, this grand, visionary plan had remained just that, a plan, a series of beautiful, detailed drawings gathering dust in a government office. It was too big, too expensive, too radical for the cautious, penny-pinching politicians of the day. But in the hot, stinking, and desperate summer of 1858, its time had finally and suddenly come. Joseph Bazalgette, the patient, stubborn engineer, the man they had ignored for years, was about to become the most important man in London, the unlikely savior of the city.
The bill introduced by Benjamin Disraeli to address the crisis, the Metropolis Local Management Amendment Bill, was a remarkably simple and brutally direct piece of legislation. It did not propose a specific plan. It did not get bogged down in the endless technical and ultimately paralyzing debates that had plagued every previous effort. It simply did three things. It gave the Metropolitan Board of Works, and by extension Joseph Bazalgette, the sole responsibility to solve the problem. It granted them the power to borrow an immense sum of £3 million, the equivalent of billions today, without the usual bureaucratic oversight. And it gave them a strict, almost impossible deadline. The work, it declared, must be completed within 5 years. It was, in effect, a declaration of martial law against the river. The debate in the House of Commons was one of the most remarkable in its long and storied history. It was a debate conducted not in an atmosphere of reasoned, gentlemanly discourse, but in a state of near universal physical misery. The stench from the river outside was a constant oppressive presence in the chamber, a silent and deeply persuasive argument for immediate action. It was the uninvited and most powerful member of the House. One member, a man from a rural constituency, rose to speak, his handkerchief pressed firmly to his nose. "Sir," he said, his voice strained, "we have been debating the sanitation of this great city for a decade. We have produced reports that could fill this very chamber, reports that have been read and filed and forgotten. And in all that time the problem has only grown worse, more monstrous, more deadly. Now the great river itself, the very artery of our empire, has risen up in judgment against us. It is no longer a matter of cost, or of competing plans, or of political convenience. It is a matter of survival. We must act, or we must abandon this city to its own filth." Another member, a man from a rural constituency, a man who had for years argued against the immense expense of a new sewer system, now rose to his feet, his face pale. "I have, in the past, expressed my most serious concerns about the cost of these grand schemes," he admitted, his voice a low rumble. "But I cannot, in good conscience, continue to do so. The evidence of our senses, the very air we are forced to breathe in this hallowed chamber, is an unanswerable argument. To delay any longer would be an act of madness, an abdication of our sacred duty to protect the people of this city." The great stink had achieved what years of scientific evidence and rational argument could not. It had made the problem personal. It had made it visceral. It had made it impossible to ignore. For the first time, the wealthy and powerful men who governed the nation were being forced to experience the same squalid, unhealthy conditions as the poorest of their subjects. The bill was passed in a matter of days, with the speed that was almost unprecedented in the slow, deliberative world of Victorian politics. The usual arguments, the usual delays, were all swept aside by the sheer overwhelming urgency of the crisis. Joseph Bazalgette was summoned to Parliament. He walked through the same foul-smelling corridors that had so tormented the politicians, but he walked with the quiet confidence of a man whose moment had finally arrived. He unrolled his great detailed maps and plans before a committee of grateful and desperate men. The politicians who had for years dismissed his plans as the expensive fantasies of an over-ambitious engineer now looked at him as a savior. They saw not a servant, but a commander, the general who would lead them to victory in this strange and disgusting war. His plan, which had been debated and dissected for years, was now approved with barely a question. He was given the money, the authority, and the mandate to begin the greatest public works project of the 19th century. As he walked out of the Palace of Westminster that day, the foul air of the Thames still hanging heavy in the street, Bazalgette must have felt a sense of profound and deeply ironic vindication. The very stench that was tormenting the city, the great stinking monster that had brought the government to its knees, was the foul-smelling wind in the sails of his own great ambition. The long, frustrating years of waiting were over. Now the real work, the great, dirty and glorious work of building a new, hidden world beneath the streets of London, was about to begin.
With the bill passed and the funds secured, the weight of London's salvation now rested squarely on the shoulders of one man, Joseph Bazalgette. He was no longer just an engineer. He was the general of a new kind of army, an army of laborers, bricklayers, and surveyors, and he was about to wage war not on a foreign enemy, but on the very ground beneath his own city. The scale of the project he was about to unleash was almost beyond comprehension. It was the moon landing of its day, a leap of engineering faith into the unknown. The plan called for 82 miles of massive, new, brick-lined interceptor sewers running parallel to the river on both sides. These were not simple pipes. They were great, subterranean tunnels, some of them over 11 feet in diameter, designed to be grand underground boulevards for the city's waste. To build these, his army would have to excavate over 3 million cubic yards of earth. They would need 318 million bricks, a number so vast that it spurred the creation of a whole new brick-making industry. And it would all be held together by a revolutionary new material, Portland cement, a mortar of incredible strength that had the ability to set and harden underwater. A crucial innovation for a project that would be constantly battling the damp, seeping soil of the Thames Basin. Bazalgette was a man possessed by his vision. In the months that followed the passing of the bill, he did not rest. His office became the war room for this immense undertaking. The walls were covered with vast, hand-drawn maps of London, so detailed that they showed not just every street, but the location of every existing sewer, every gas pipe, every water main, every forgotten crypt and Roman ruin that lay beneath the city's surface. He was a master of detail,
A man who understood that a single miscalculated gradient, a single mistake of a few inches over a mile, could spell disaster for the entire system. He was a quiet, unassuming man in person, often dressed in simple, dark clothes. He did not have the flamboyant personality of a great politician or a charismatic general, but he possessed an unshakable, almost fanatical self-confidence in his own calculations. He faced immense pressure and criticism. Other engineers, rivals in his field, published pamphlets declaring his plan to be a monstrous folly, predicting that his great tunnels would collapse under the weight of the city, or that his pumping stations would fail, flooding entire districts with raw sewage. The newspapers, while grateful that something was being done, were skeptical. They called his project the Great Bore, a play on words that captured both the immense scale of the tunneling and the public's weary disbelief that such a thing could even be accomplished. Bazalgette ignored them all. He trusted his numbers. He trusted his design. He moved with a quiet, relentless, and methodical purpose. He began the immense task of hiring his army. He needed thousands of men, a special breed of laborers known as navvies. These were the men who had built the great canals and railways of Britain, tough, hard-living and nomadic workers renowned for their immense physical strength and their prodigious capacity for both hard work and hard drinking. They came to London from all over the country, drawn by the promise of steady, if dangerous, work. He divided his grand plan into a series of manageable contracts, and the great engineering firms of the day bid for the chance to be a part of this historic project. The city of London began to transform. Great work sites were established. Steam engines, the noisy, smoke-belching heart of the industrial age, were brought in to power the pumps and the cranes. Mountains of bricks and sand and gravel began to appear on the banks of the Thames. The people of London watched this massive mobilization with a mixture of hope and trepidation. They were desperate for a solution to the great stink, but they were also fearful of the disruption that this great surgical operation on their city would cause. The streets would be torn up, the noise of the steam engines and the construction would be relentless. But there was a sense, for the first time in a long time, that a real and permanent solution was finally at hand. Joseph Bazalgette, the quiet, stubborn architect of the underworld, was ready to begin his great and filthy masterpiece.
The work began almost immediately, and it transformed the city of London into a vast, chaotic, and deafeningly loud construction site. This was not a project confined to a single area. It was a war waged on a massive front, a long, surgical incision made through the very heart of the world's largest and most crowded metropolis. For the next decade, London would not be a city of elegant parks and quiet squares, but a city of trenches, of steam engines, of mountains of earth, and of the constant, rhythmic sound of an army of men at work. The soldiers in this army were a special breed of men, the navvies. These were the laborers who had built the great canals and railways of Britain, a nomadic and notoriously tough class of workers. They were men of immense physical strength, renowned for their ability to shift tons of earth with nothing more than a shovel in a wheelbarrow. They came to London in their thousands, drawn by the promise of steady, if dangerous, work. They lived in their own temporary encampments, a city of rough wooden shacks that sprung up along the route of the new sewers. They were a tribe apart, with their own dialect, their own customs, and a reputation for hard drinking and brutal fighting. The work they performed was of a scale and a difficulty that is hard to imagine today. The main method of construction was cut and cover. First, a deep, wide trench, sometimes over 40 feet deep, would be dug along the line of the new sewer. The streets of London were torn up, their cobblestones removed, revealing the dark ancient earth beneath. The navvies would descend into these great open wounds in the city, their bodies dwarfed by the sheer scale of the excavation. The work was done almost entirely by hand. Armies of men with picks and shovels would attack the dense, wet London clay, loading the earth into great wooden buckets. These buckets would then be lifted out of the trench by steam-powered cranes, their engines hissing and belching thick black coal smoke into the already polluted air. It was dangerous, backbreaking, and relentless work. The trenches were a constant, treacherous environment. The walls, made of unstable, waterlogged soil, were in a constant state of collapse. Men were frequently injured and sometimes killed by sudden landslides of mud and clay. They encountered a hidden and often horrifying history of London beneath the streets. They dug through the foundations of Roman buildings, unearthing ancient mosaic floors and forgotten pottery. They cut through the burial pits of the Great Plague of 1666, unearthing the skeletons of thousands of long-dead Londoners, a grim and constant reminder of the city's long and deadly relationship with disease. Once the trench was dug, the bricklayers would descend. They were the master craftsmen of the project, and their work was a thing of beauty and of profound, enduring strength. They stood on wooden scaffolding in the damp, claustrophobic darkness of the trench, and they began to build. They laid hundreds of millions of bricks, creating the great, curving, cathedral-like arches of the new sewers. The quality of their work was so high that these tunnels, built over a century and a half ago, are still in use today, a silent, subterranean testament to their skill. The work continued day and night, in all weathers. By the light of flickering gas lamps and great open braziers, the armies of Joseph Bazalgette toiled on, slowly, painstakingly, building their new, hidden river beneath the sleeping city.
After nearly a decade of relentless and often dangerous labor, the great work was finally complete. In 1865, the first sections of the new integrated sewer system were ready to be opened. The event was marked with a grand formal ceremony, a moment of profound civic pride and relief. The Prince of Wales himself, the future King Edward VII, was invited to inspect one of the great new pumping stations that Bazalgette had built to lift the sewage from the lower-lying areas of the city. These pumping stations were not just functional buildings, they were temples of Victorian engineering, magnificent cathedrals of cast iron, polished brass, and intricate brickwork. They were designed with a sense of aesthetic grandeur, a belief that even the most utilitarian of structures should be a thing of beauty. The great steam engines, the powerful heart of these stations, worked with a silent, powerful, and almost hypnotic rhythm, their great flywheels turning with an unstoppable grace. The prince and the assembled dignitaries were stunned by the scale and the beauty of this hidden industrial world that lay beneath their feet. The true test, however, came when the system was finally connected. The sluice gates were opened, and for the first time, the millions of gallons of raw sewage that had for centuries poured directly into the Thames were intercepted. They were diverted into Bazalgette's great new subterranean river. The effect on the city was almost immediate, and it was nothing short of miraculous. The great stink of 1858, which had returned with varying degrees of intensity every summer since 1858, simply disappeared. The foul, oppressive miasma that had haunted the city for generations was gone, replaced by the simple, clean, and almost forgotten smell of a living river. The health of this city was transformed. The cholera epidemics, which had been a terrifying and regular feature of London life, vanished. The last major outbreak occurred in 1866 in an area of the East End that had not yet been connected to Bazalgette's new system. It was a grim and final proof of his work. The physician John Snow's germ theory, which had been dismissed as an eccentric fantasy just a few years before, was now vindicated in the most dramatic and undeniable way possible. The cleaning of the river had broken the cycle of disease and death. The River Thames itself began a slow and miraculous recovery. The thick, black, anaerobic sludge that had choked it for so long was slowly washed away by the tides. The water, once opaque and foul, began to clear,
And then, for the first time in centuries, life returned. Fish were seen swimming in the river once more. Birds returned to its banks. The river, which had been a symbol of death and decay, was a living thing again. Joseph Bazalgette, the quiet, stubborn engineer, was hailed as a national hero. He had saved London. His great, hidden masterpiece, the vast and complex network of sewers that lay beneath the feet of the city's inhabitants, was and remains one of the greatest and most important engineering achievements of the 19th century. It is a strange and deeply ironic legacy. The greatest monument to the Victorian age, the public work that had the most profound and lasting impact on the health and the lives of millions of people, is a thing that is almost entirely invisible. It is a hidden, subterranean world of darkness, of filth, and of a quiet, relentless, and life-giving flow. The Great Stink of 1858 was a moment of profound crisis, a time when a great city was brought to its knees by its own success, by its own filth. But it was also a moment of profound transformation. It was a crisis that forced a generation of politicians and engineers to think on a scale that had never been imagined before, to create a solution that was as bold, as ambitious, and as enduring as the great city it was built to serve. It is a story of how a summer of unbearable, suffocating stench, a summer of pure, disgusting misery, led in the end to a cleaner, healthier, and better world.